This was conceived as a bit of a fireside chat in the sense that it's going to be informal, and I've urged the panel to discuss, amongst themselves as well as with all of you, a conversation about as the conversation picks up. And I also have very much thought it was an opportunity for us to look, weave the Asia Society into the broader dialogue. So. Vishaka on my left was the 7th president of the Asia Society, I believe. And Bob on her left is 6th, was the 4th president of the Asia Society?
Yes.
So Robert Oxnam Vishaka is a highly regarded, one of the kind of leaders in the world of contemporary arts and culture. She's now at the Guggenheim. And Columbia. Robert Oxnam is a highly regarded scholar of China. We're quite honored to have both of them, and they are a couple, actually, which makes it really interesting. And Orville Schell is the Arthur Ross Director of the Asia Society Center for U.S. China Relations. And I've worked for Orville in the past, and he came to the Asia Society to really bring a wealth of expertise. So this is an opportunity for us to look at the broader Asia Pacific and the role of the Asia Society in the Asia Pacific. And I'd like to start with Bob. You've been with the Asia, I think we figured out you were the 4th president of the Asia Society. How did you view the Asia Pacific, and particularly China, but also the rest of the Asia Pacific? And what did you expect if somebody had said to you in 1981 when you became president and said, Bob, give us a prediction for 30 years later, or 35 years later, what the world would look like, what would you have said?
I think back then, can you all hear me? Or is it on? Turn it on. Does that work better? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. I think what I would have said then is that there was clearly going to be substantial growth over time, that when I became president, it was a period of time, this is in the 1970s, that the economic takeoff was clearly evident in much of East and Southeast Asia. But the enormous increase in not only economically, but in communication around the Pacific Rim and our involvement in that area have also grown, I think, in ways that were exponentially beyond what I thought at the beginning. I should say that I like your idea of looking at the next big idea, and that is, it reminds me of how the Asia Society got started, which is John D. Rockefeller III had this wonderful idea that in a period of difficulty in the 1950s, that when people thought about Asia, you thought about war. You thought about World War II, you thought about the Korean War, and then into the 60s, we thought about the Vietnam War. And his great idea, his big idea, was this is the time to establish an Asia Society and a Japan Society, because the public at large needed to have other visions of Asia. And that's why he concentrated on art and music in the first 2 decades. It was further complicated, of course, because it was the McCarthy era. And so we had a domestic kind of reaction to Asia. And I think it was a brilliant, big new idea. And that I was the beneficiary of what the groundwork that he had laid.
So Vishaka, please.
Of course. This is kind of our breakfast and lunch and dinner conversations. He says something and I want to modify it, and then I say something and he wants to contradict me, story of our lives.
I never do that.
Never. I think that what's really worthwhile remembering is that talk about the next big idea. 1956, when Asia Society is founded, one of the first World Bank report comes out on Asia. And the prediction is which country or countries will make it big in Asia. And guess the 2 countries that they thought were going to be really important. The Philippines and Burma. They thought China, communist country, never going to make it, forget it. India, would be lucky if it stays a country together because it had never been a nation together. So I'm always mindful of the next big idea. Depends on who's talking, you know. But I do think that what is special about the Asia Society, starting from the founding days, is that it was always about looking out and see what is the world you're not just living in, but that you need to live in. So for John D. III to say, yes, Asia is down right now in 1956, it is important to recognize these millennial cultures of Asia will be important again, as they have been in the past. And it behooves us to understand, it behooves us to respect them. And for him, it wasn't just some idea. The guy had been going there since 1929. He was going every year, and this is the times when it took you months to get there, and you hung out and you spent the time there. He spent 3 months there, every month until the war broke out. So it was deep connection, deep commitment, and a belief that millennial cultures count. That's why I think it's so important that arts and culture were right there, right from the beginning, and politically, during the McCarthy era, as you said rightly, that politics were problematic, especially if you're going to... He was for opening up to mainland China before we did it. But he got in a lot of trouble for that, right? For saying that.
But he also had, along with his wife Blanchette, a passion for Asian art and dealing with people who were artists themselves or collectors. And every year, from 1928 on until the Asia Society was established.
No, and the war broke out.
And the war broke out. They made a trip, and a long trip, and established a group of friends. So they didn't think of people in Asia as distant. They thought them as friends. And eventually he created a program called the Williamsburg Program, first meeting, which brought together people in government, people in business, people in academic life, and to share their ideas and their concerns. So in many ways, he was a pioneering figure in facing difficult questions and off the record approach. Very important to where the Asia Society has gone from that point on.
Got it. So Orville, as someone who has spent a lifetime studying Asia, and in some ways, this question really was something that grew out of a conversation between you and me. Where did you think the world would be in the 60s and 70s, and compared to where it is today?
Well, as Robert's just said, when we all sort of came into this whole proposition, Asia really was on fire, and it was an incredibly antagonistic situation. And I mean, our whole lifetime. From the Korean War to the Vietnam War, and with China being viewed as a sort of epicenter of wars of national liberation that were spewing out around the rest of the globe. It was unimaginable to think that we would be where we were when you started at the Asia Society in the early 80s. I first went to China in 1975 and spent several months working there. And I mean, there wasn't one scintilla of evidence that the worm would have turned the way it finally did a few years later. And if you had suggested it, it's a little bit like now in North Korea. People it's not admissible as evidence. So I think that's simply to say that the Lord works in mysterious ways, and it's very difficult to know what is going to happen, particularly in a country that, in my view, is historically is sort of unresolved as China. And what I mean by that is I think it's its great virtue and its great weakness. It keeps trying things on, and to see what becomes it, because it really underwent a thing that no other country in modern times has undergone, namely a total dismantling of its culture, its body politic, and an overturning of society, or at least an attempt to overturn it. So at the end of all of that, it had to figure out how are we going to put this thing back together again? And that's what the great experiment that Deng Xiaoping started is all about. And we're still in it. But none of this was conceivable when Mao was alive. I mean, I was going to these study meetings and, criticizing Lin Biao and Confucius. And, you couldn't imagine it, outside this hermetically sealed box that anything was going to get in to change it in any meaningful way. It seemed like what China would be eternal. But
we also had a challenge. You and I were involved in something called the China Council.
I remember it well.
And it began in 1975. We had an idea that there should be a national organization to work on public education in the United States about China and the United States and our potential over time. And for a period of 5 years, we had programs all around the United States. We mobilized business people and academics and gave speeches all over and had programs on television. And I think we had an effect in terms of easing the sense of what would happen if we normalized with China. And then lo and behold, one day it happened, right, in 1979, which really was a transformative moment in terms of our relationship. But the Asia Society could be proud of that.
I mean, I think Carter actually deserves every bit and perhaps more deference for bringing the two countries together than Kissinger.
Yeah.
Because that was an incredible piece of theater in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping came to this country. And everybody was given permission to relax and just try to be in a different sort of frame of mind about each other.
So you have this period of when Asia's on fire from really the end of the Second World War, well, actually the Second World War, until the end of the 1980s, when China seems to stabilize, India seems to be starting to show some forward momentum. And Francis Fukuyama publishes The End of History, which predicts basically a liberal democratic future for all of us. So looking back at that time, if you thought that Fukuyama's thesis was the right thesis, what went wrong? Vishaka.
Oh, my God. I think that when we look at it, I even remember at that moment and what I thought, and we talked about that, and I said, what arrogance to think that it is now entirely going to be sole. Essentially, it was about the century of the sole superpower called America. And it was therefore this rise of liberal democracy. It was going to be everywhere. And if you ever think about perspectives from other parts of the world, you just have to say, be careful, because this is really putting it out there saying, now there are no other ideas, no other ideology. And at that particular moment, remember 89 and Tiananmen happens. And he didn't really take that into account because it was all about the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so I think to some extent, it again reminds us that at that moment, if we had thought that it is no longer going to be about the ideologies as we have known it, but it may be something else. And let us think about what that something else could be. That's where the next big idea could have been useful, rather than assuming that that's where the things were going. And for me, I'm not a political scientist nor a policy person like these guys are, but I'm a political science junkie, so I read this stuff. And I do think that often, if you don't look at things from the perspective of somebody else, from another person, another culture, outside in, you're likely to make more mistakes because you assume the way you think is the way the world is going.
You know, mentioning 1989 reminds us not only of Tiananmen, but the fact that in the early 1990s, but beginning really in 1989, the commitment to have a center in Hong Kong, which is the first center in the Pacific that the Asia Society's had, many, many organizations were retreating from China. And in part through Jack's work and a number of other colleagues in Hong Kong, we were able to say, this is the time to move. That's how you attack the next big idea. And as a result, we now have a proliferation of centers. But the flagship was the Hong Kong Center. It all happened in that period. And I remember that people said, you know, that's really kind of crazy to go in just as everybody else is leaving. We said, no, that's how you make money, I think. But it's certainly how you make friends in Asia.
Orville? Sorry. Well, I was thinking about your approach to Frank.
No, I have no particular comment at the moment.
All right. So we fast forward to today. And I'm going to open it up for questions afterwards, so please feel free. But the world that today is obviously very different from that which we would have I think any of us would have predicted. Arrogance or not over the Fukuyama. Just by the way, for the record, as an historian, it offended me at the time too, because the world is littered with great empires that look like they were going to be great forever. And
all you have to do is read Kennedy, and you'll know.
So. But where are we going now? I guess there's a couple questions. Some of these verge on policy, some of these verge on social, and some of these verge on something that transcends all of those. But we're at a moment of real inflection, and I think actually real danger. So you've got a world in which you basically have three poles emerging, it seems to me. One is China, one is still the United States, and the third is either India or potentially Europe. So in this situation, one hesitates to predict, especially given the fact that we thought Myanmar and Philippines were the countries of the future 50 years ago.
World Bank.
Sorry, World Bank thought that these were the countries of the future, and who knows, maybe they will be someday. But at the moment, what do you think it's all going to shake out? Orville, since you had no comment last, I'll start with you.
Well, I think you speak of an inflection point, and I think it's undeniably true. And I think it is sort of, I ponder this question. I think up until the present, we have been able to have a presumption, really from Kissinger and Carter in 1979 on down, that we've had a policy of engagement, which is presupposed that things are slowly coming together between these very different systems, very different cultures, very different parts of the world. I mean, it's a kind of a Hegelian notion that history is moving in a common direction. And this, I think, underlay a lot of work that civil society organizations did, businessmen. You remember the quaint old saw that open markets equal open societies? Everybody had a version of this. And we had a terrible bump in the road in 1989, but then things got back on track again. And I think what distinguishes this moment and makes everybody's work different is that that very question now is being called into question as to whether there is a converging path or whether the lines are a little out of parallel going the other way. And this, of course, all derives from the leadership of China today and some of the kinds of notions of China as being a model, not wanting to buy into the Fukuyama dream, and they have their own dream. They're going their own direction. So this puts some very basic, I think, policy questions and questions about, for instance, the value of cultural exchange. I mean, if, in fact, we're sort of drifting apart, what good does it do to send a few more ballet troupes or educate a few more people? At least you have to ask that question. So that's where I think we are. And I think it's bedeviling everybody. And I think Trump, in all his bipolarity, is a kind of an expression, too, of a kind of a dim, very dim, recognition that there is something changing and something's out of balance and something is afoot.
Bob?
You think? My sense is that one of the great things about the Asian society is in a difficult moment. We're clearly in a difficult moment and an unpredictable moment, and where much of the world is looking aghast, as many of us are. But at that point, one needs to realize that it's not just a question bilaterally of U.S. China. It's a question of our relationship throughout the entire Asia-Pacific region. And therefore, I'm delighted that this is an institution which is pan-Pacific and inclusive. I, by the way, single-handedly added two countries to Asia Society's Asia. Yeah, this is a very powerful position you get, Australia and New Zealand, and they've loved me ever since. And I'm actually wearing a alligator crossing tie, so to prove that. But I do think that it's a multinational issue. And in fact, it's a global issue as to where Asia goes in the future. There are so many positive trends when you look behind the headlines. There's so many things happening in the business world. There's so many things happening in the intra-Asian relationship world that we have to hope that leadership will transform, change, and that will build on some momentum that this institution has helped create. And so I think you don't have to speak in words that are excessive about American democracy, but you do have to speak with passion about looking at art and looking at culture and looking at education, looking at relationships throughout the region. And that's the essence of the Asia Society, I think.
Vishaka?
I think that when we ask the question of is it Francis Fukuyama, where it was, and where it is headed right now, and where we are, we're still looking at the world in a kind of a bipolar way, which is that there is now emerging Beijing consensus, if you will, or the Chinese way, or the American way. And I personally feel that I think that it really is something about the notion of the multipolar world. So even if it is China higher, more supreme power, more important power than America, let's say, that would be a big deal. But even if that happens, both of them still have to function in a multipolar, globalized, interconnected, interdependent world. So the challenge for us is no longer just about two forms of ideology. One could say today our democracy gives us a kind of a bad name, given what we have in the White House, right? So we can't say this is a model, as much as we also worry about what has happened with Xi Jinping to some extent because of what he has done. So I just think that it's no longer about this clear-cut bipolar ideology. It has to do with national versus transnational interdependent world, the rise of nationalism that we see everywhere, whether it's in Turkey, whether it is to some extent even in a place like India, where while Modi talks about more of a global arena, there's a lot of stuff going on that's very, very anti-global when it happens within a national domestic setting. So my point is that if you're going to think about going forward, what would it take for us to truly think of ourselves as living in this multipolar societies in which we try to understand our place and other people's places in the world? And why I think this is important is not just because I think Asian society has arts and culture, or as Orville said last night, that really we still need that interpersonal connection. And I think that today our work is not done because with all the interconnection, with all the interdependence, the kind of communication we have, do we still understand the differences that brings us together or not? Are we really willing to take that time? And I believe that the problem has been that arts and culture have been often put into a consumption category. You go and enjoy a performance. You go and do this. It is not seen as fundamental to human experience and how it can relate. And that work still needs to be done. It isn't just simply to say, I'm going to create a performance like Madame Mao that will explain socialism. No, I'm not talking about that. It's not instrumentalizing art. But it is about understanding the relationship between artistic and cultural expression and the political milieu in which they work, and try to understand deeper. So it's no longer enough to have superficial understanding. And that work, I think, is more necessary today than it was at any other time because A, we are fragmented, B, over-specialized in knowledge, and C, therefore, synthetic learning that we need to do and the work we need to do Neither our politicians nor most of the other people who are in leadership position are thinking about synthetic way of connecting and learning. That work is still something that's necessary, especially more now than ever before.
So I want to tease out something, actually, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. But you actually made an interesting comment. Well, the whole comment was interesting. But one of the points you made, which I thought was really interesting, was talking about the United States as kind of a tarnished model right now. And I would like to actually pull that out because I think, again, this harkens back to my earlier comments about the sort of future of liberal democracy in Fukuyama. But what is the model in the future, and how do you take essentially what looks to me like almost the siloization of nations within their own very specific spheres, and keep the flame alive for a more international system where, in fact, we do understand one another? Because it seems to me that we're moving in a direction where understanding has become more limited.
I mean, that's what I was getting at, that I think that rise of nationalism, ultra-nationalism, to some extent, as Du Wei-Ming, who's a great philosopher, used to be at Harvard and is now at Beida, used to say that actually globalization and Balkanization are the two sides of the same coins. It's exactly when borders begin to break is when people want to hold on to smaller and smaller things. So we mustn't think of it as, it's a reaction to some extent of this kind of larger world we live in. But I think in the name of globalization, we also have not understood that cultural specificity doesn't go away. It is the intermixing of that breadth and the depth that have to come together. And that's the piece that I think is that what I call the more nuanced understanding of those two. So it isn't just, I don't think today any country in the world, if you look at environment, do you think that Fiji can actually just worry about what's going to happen to it because it is going to go underwater? It is everybody's problem. If you think about the global flow of money, that money is still going just the way, perhaps not as much, but the same level. So you have economy that's interdependent. You have environment that's interdependent. So no matter how much Trump wants to think about make America great again, whatever that imagined time is, it is not possible to think of yourself only in national category. But we sometimes want to believe that it is somehow now going to go back to some other place, which I don't believe is possible because the trends, all the big trends are all in one direction, which is both about global and locally specific. And we have to work on those. And that's where just I have to get the arts in because you didn't ask a single question about the arts. I just want you to know. And that is, there you go. And that is that arts really have that capacity to both think and express specificity of a place and transcend the place and to be part of the global. They're the perfect expression of the moment we live in now. And that's why if we understand the artistic expressions, whether it's in visual, performing arts, music, what have you, we actually would get somewhere to understand that duality and multiplicity of meaning that our lives must have today.
So, Bob, in your capacity as the 4th president of the Asia Society, would you like to modify anything the 6th president of the Asia Society has said?
No, I agree with everything she says. No, I will add one other thing, though, and that is that there are a lot of ways to look at the moment that we're in. I mean, there's no question that we're going to quickly alter the difficulties that we have at the White House. But I think if you look at the long range, which may be 5, 10, 15 years, there are trends operating in Asia, many of which are not given enough attention, that are transformative. Just for example, that China has in the last 5 years taken on a green energy approach that is going to change all of our lives because it will be so far ahead. And that Donald Trump wouldn't understand a word that I just said. But the fact of the matter is that it affects people in the business community, it affects people who are involved in Asia, it affects the Asia Society. And I think one of the jobs of the Asia Society is to work in the world of art and culture, because that's not only what is transformative for individuals, it's what connects cultures together. But I think to do precisely the same in terms of dealing with economic developments, and that's why we have, in fact, the business program in the Asia Society was started on my watch. I'm proud to see that it continues. But we can, as an institution, play a role which is looking ahead to an Asia 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ahead, just as we have had transformative moments in the future. This could be a moment in which we do some very interesting things as an institution. So I'd leave it there. But otherwise, I agree with everything she said.
Got it. That's excellent. Orville, do you want to comment on any of the trends? Bob alluded to trends that are emerging now coming from Asia that I think are going to transform the global marketplace of ideas. That's a small topic, I know.
We're going to have a transformation. The only question is what kind of a transformation. And I do think that, you know, that culture can be an enormously helpful solvent when things begin to rub against each other. And I think we may be over the period of ideology, but we're not over the period of big power competition. In fact, I think we're entering into a whole new version of that. So, and we're ill-acquainted with it. So I think that this is an incredibly important time to try to figure out how do you interact with a country like China that is rising, that is proud, that has got much to crow about, many accomplishments. It can be arrogant, it can be a bully, it can be a lot of things, and yet it is an inescapable player, and you could just go down the list of all the problems that beset us, and we can't escape it. So we have to figure out how to work with it. And this is going to be, I think it's getting more difficult rather than less difficult. And I don't think we have very many minds who have much of a sense of how we're going to do this thing. So you have the paradox on the one hand of all these things happening and shared interest and in global markets and connections. And on the other hand, you have things separating. It's a paradox that we are moving forward at the same time we're moving backwards. And how do we factor that equation out finally? I don't know. I don't know anybody who has any really good ideas about that right now.
Oh boy. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and our mic runner here is Zhuan Wei, who, when she's not actually handling microphones, does our sustainability program. So Zhuan.
Peter Calthorpe. So I want to actually touch back to something earlier in the discussion, but I think it's very relevant to what happens going forward globally, which is self-correction. How did China come out of the tailspin of the Cultural Revolution? And how did they do it in a way that didn't have lasting animosity and vindictiveness? Perhaps it is still there. But the idea of countries and economies self-correcting seems to be foundational in what we all look forward to. And if we can't identify how that happens, we're in trouble. And it seems to be one of the most dramatic examples of it was the ending of the Cultural Revolution. How did it happen?
I think that the easiest answer is leadership. I think Deng Xiaoping, if you look at it, and Xi Jinping have a sort of comprehensive notion of what modernization, step 1, step 2, step 3, how it should be shaped, and a capacity to make it happen. And we have gone through the turbulence that is built into our democratic system at one of its tragic moments today. And it's very hard for us to have that kind of continuity. I must say, when Xi Jinping managed to put himself into a lifetime role as leadership, I was not fully amazed. I felt, in fact, enormously comfortable in one respect. That is, I'm a specialist on Qing Dynasty China, and suddenly the notion of imperial power, something I fully understand as a result. I've got to write a book on this. But the point really is, to me, individuals who can provide continuity, who can set goals and growth, who can work with a business community. We lack that kind of precision. Not that I would say give up democracy and get it, but let us look for people who are internationalists rather than, I won't say the alternative, but he lives not far from us. We live in New York. He doesn't, actually. He's probably in Florida. But.
That's a really, really good question. I mean, how did it come to pass? And I think there's no easy answer, but I think, you know, I noted earlier that I thought China was in sort of trying things on, historically speaking, after the end of the last dynasty. And the attack that China launched on itself to search out the reasons why it had been weak and had been preyed upon by the great powers, ended up with an attack on its culture, on everything. And Mao was the final expression of that. And yet that didn't really work. It was a pretty savage period. And I think there was a lot of recognition of that. And when Deng Xiaoping came along, who had suffered, he thought, well, let's try on a new suit of clothes. And I think we see a little bit of that with Xi Jinping. I mean, you don't lose the imperial sort of style, and Mao certainly had a good piece of that. So I think, you know, and then people came out of the Maoist period, and they'd been so sort of suffocated in a way that this energy that got released was just extraordinary, and there was such a sense of relief, and actually then the kind of Confucian construct of hard work, family, organization, good bureaucracy, all these things which Mao had tried to destroy, sort of came back into the picture and turned out to be a great asset, sort of lurking beneath the surface. Mao tried his damnedest to extirpate it all, but he only went so far. So I don't know. It's an amazing thing, and I suspect we haven't seen the end of it. That this China reinventing itself is the result of having sort of debilitated, torn itself down. You know, Mao's great expression, 不破不立, without destruction, there can be no construction. Well, that guy did a hell of a good job. And now it leaves a kind of a curious blank sheet of paper. He also extolled, by the way, the notion of a blank sheet of paper, waiting to be written on, he said, by the most beautiful characters.
I mean,
you know, there's just one thing I want to add, and that is that the courting of the business community by the leadership, not just the Chinese, but internationally as well, have given China, I think, a singular great leap forward that actually worked. And if you look at the way in which it was only in 2002, I believe, that capitalists could become members of the Chinese Communist Party. But lots of them have come along ever since then. So I think taking an approach which uses political leadership along with entrepreneurial leadership is a pretty special model. And it is produced now, what, 2.5 decades of remarkable growth.
But I think, to me, when I hear the Chinese model, one of the things that I always start to think about is, what do you extrapolate from that? And one of the things that Orville was talking about is this notion of attack on itself. And that kind of complete attack that begins even before Mao and then again with Mao is so uniquely Chinese, as is the idea of Confucianism coming back into the system. So that whenever we think about correction, and I think about it from the Indian side of things, is that the correction is, in the Indian context, never a revolution. It is always incremental and evolution. because the complexity is always thought about in a very different way. So there's no way that Indian leaders would ever talk about a clean sheet, ever. It was the ideational quality of India as a civilization on which the new nation, which is a very new nation, was built. And when corrections occur, it is never to attack the system itself, because the system itself in anti-colonial rule was what was privileged, and that privilege occurs. So I think that one of the things we can learn from in different places, that what happened in China can't really happen everywhere else. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the corrections that need to occur here? What would it be? I mean, if you think about Watergate and then you have Carter coming in, you know that we are also very much a reactive society. That would be a different kind of correction. After, hopefully when Trump goes, that's a different matter. So we have to kind of think about what are those corrective mechanisms that are maybe culturally specific and not just simply something that's transferable from one place to another.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Pablo Quintanilla. I serve on the advisory board here in Northern California. I was thinking a lot about the role that the Asia Society can play, today and in the future. And I wanted to ask, from your perspective, is that role one of facilitator, convener, interpreter, influencer? What is it? What if you had to pick one word to sort of explain what is it that the Asia Society has to really contribute to this conversation or this dialogue? Like, what is that?
I don't think there's one word. I think you gave us all the words. I think educator, I would put at the very top. I would put source of inspiration next. I would say a way of thinking in multiple directions. I mean, that's what we've been trying to do over a long period of time. Sometimes I worry, as you worry, that we get so fixed on China and the U.S. China relationship that we're tempted to spend too much time on that. And there, in fact, are an enormous number of trends that are going on elsewhere in the world. Those of you who are in the business community can tell you in every part of Asia, there are dynamic possibilities that people are tapping. So I think those are the kinds of perspectives that we ought to have. Not just bilateral, not just multilateral, but regional, sectional, all kinds of things can be done. And I think the Asia Society has done a pretty good job of that over the years.
Let me just say, I think that the words you use, convener, facilitator, all of these are words that are processes. How do we do it? But what is it that we want to think about? To me, part of it is to really dealing with the kind of conversation we've had right now is to think ahead and understand where the world is headed and what are the ways of both interpreting it for others and then convene, facilitate, be the bridge builder, whatever you need to do as processes, but always to have your eye a little bit further ahead than just the current. So it's a long view combined with the short view. And I think when we only do the short view, we then run the risk of being irrelevant very quickly. And so we have to kind of keep thinking about both the long and the short.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I want to sort of restate Pablo's question, not that he didn't do a great job the first time, but stating a similar question or an aspect of your question, but from a different angle. If you were to critique the Asia Society, what would you say you wish the Asia Society did differently or put more emphasis on, or what direction do you feel we need to go as a matter of course correction?
Let's try that. I think here we're having a little talking head session. And we do culture, we do film, we do all these other things. Rachel Cooper sitting here has some amazingly wonderful shows in the cultural realm. But you know, we rarely do these things together. And I think that's an incredible sort of missing something really important about life. I mean, nobody wants to just policy wonk. Some people don't even want to just go and see the Ramayana dance for 16 hours. But, you know, maybe they might like to kind of mix things up and hear some politics, some economics, some discussion. So I think that's actually something that we really, really don't do as well as we could.
I would say, I was just going to actually say that I think in a way we are multidisciplinary, but we are not interdisciplinary enough, so that we don't actually learn from each other and then to create a whole, which is our unique advantage. And when we do that, people really like it. However, there's also a challenge, and that is that since I live in the world of academy right now, there is the over-specialization that's a métier in which people function. And so when you reach out to the general public, they're also saying, wait a minute, but what is this about? So they also could cause confusion. So at some point, and it's something Jack and I've talked about recently, is to say, ultimately, Asia Society always needs to be a thought leader no matter where you are. Create a wave, not just ride a wave. No matter what it is we do, so that people say, my God, I never thought about that. Oh my God, I never saw that before. I got something new as an understanding that I didn't know existed. And how do we create that idea, no matter where we are? Because the competition is enormous now. Plenty of people convene. Plenty of people are doing talking heads. So what is it that we're going to do that will set us apart? I think it's a question we, the Asia Society, must always ask.
Bruce, may I tell a 1-minute story?
Absolutely.
We had a gala, and we invited the former president of Taiwan to come, because we thought he was he and the mainland had gotten along well. And then we invited the Chinese diplomats to come. The day before, we got calls. Okay, the Chinese diplomat said, if you mention the word president, we'll have to walk out for the president of Taiwan. If you sit him further forward in the room than we will have to walk out. Then the president of Taiwan had his demands, and it was high dudgeon. But we had a concert that went before this with some amazing performers from the Silk Road Ensemble and others. And it was really, and this woman who plays a 5-string banjo, who speaks Chinese, who plays with a Chinese guzheng player. It was fantastic. These guys all came up. They sat down at dinner peacefully and quietly. Nobody walked out. And the next day, the diplomats from Beijing emailed me to say that this was one of the most wonderful events they'd ever been to. So I thought, bingo. You know, music does have the ability to soothe the savage beast, and we ought to bring it on board, and a little art and a little theater and all the rest of it.
And we did exactly the same thing with Iran. Long before there were, and we were one of the only institutions to do back-channel work on Iran, right? But it all began with a performance, as Rachel will remember, of Shajarian, a great musician. We did a private concert at the Asia Society, and the Iranian diplomats were there, and folks from the U.S. side were there. Very informal, private conversation that began a process that we began afterwards, because Iranians trusted us, and it had to do with us respecting their culture.
So I'd like to say one last thing, and that is this lovely lady over here has been holding up a sign that says "Wrap it up." So this is the time.
Yeah, but since I'm the executive director, we can carry it out a little longer. You want to say something?
That's what I said.
Oh. Well, I was going to give you one last. So I'm going to have. First of all, let me comment that was actually couldn't have been better timed. We have our team from Asia Society Southern California. We have Rachel. We've got people from New York. So, in fact, we have a pretty good representation of the Asia Society global family. So maybe we can do more here. I'd like to give one last person, and the answers are going to have to be one-breath answers, and the question's going to have to be a one-breath question. But if you can say it really fast, we'll wrap it up after your question.
I'm not so sure it's a one-breath question. I'm Lori Goldman. The question has to do with damage and mitigation. When we look back about a little over a year ago, the United States was joining TPP. It was going ahead with 12 countries. We had a lot of funding for the arts and culture, and things have changed a little bit since then in that we are now, the United States is backtracking from global trade. We're becoming more protectionist. Funding for the arts has been cut. I wanted to ask about kind of how much damage long-term will this lead to, and what can the Asia Society do to kind of mitigate some of that damage? Sorry, that was
is not possible.
Yeah. You raise a very important point, and that is that if you do not understand, as this president does not understand anything international, and particularly in terms of the Pacific, what obviously was going through his head is we're going to insult them by saying, oh, this was the previous administration's desire, and we're not going to do it. You missed an enormous opportunity to have a kind of collective way of coping with China, which is exactly what we're talking about here. And so I think you raise an important point. It's precisely the sort of conversations, though, that we ought to have here at the Asia Society.
But
over time.
I think that the question you're asking, which is that how much damage can be done further, and can we repair it, or what can Asia Society do? And I think that because Asia Society is a nonpartisan organization, it really has to be seen as how do we understand the issue and how do we highlight the issue. So the implication of not joining TPP or understanding why this multilateral, what is intra-Asia trade all about? What does that really mean? What is OBOR all about, which is something that our policy folks are working on. But the other thing is to really look at, for the first time in a long time, prior to the arrival of the Europeans, that Asia is beginning to now have the kind and level of connections that didn't exist before. And most of the Americans don't really understand that. So we have to continue to highlight questions that at least you would understand. It's not like you're going to mitigate against a systemic failure of the government, because that's a tall order.
Orville, you want to say one last? Okay, so on behalf of us, thank you for participating. This has been an all-star cast we've had up here. Orville Schell, Robert Oxnam, Vishaka Desai, every one of them deep scholars in their field. And I'm now going to invite Eric Best up for the second panel. You can stay in your seats. It's going to be a pretty seamless transition. And Eric's going to have the next conversation on the next big idea.